They ate in silence for 2,055 nights. Then the soup steamed, the fire hissed, and she whispered, "Husband," like it had always been his name. The word did not shatter the quiet. It fell into it, a single stone dropped into a deep, still well, the ripples spreading out in slow, concentric circles that touched every corner of the small cabin. Samuel Dorr did not look up from his bowl. His spoon, halfway to his mouth, paused for a beat, the weight of it suddenly unfamiliar in his hand. He could feel the heat of the broth on the metal, the scent of dried herbs and salt pork rising in the air. Nothing had changed. The fire still crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The wind still mourned around the eaves of the cabin, a low, constant complaint against the coming of another winter. And yet, everything had changed. The silence that had been their companion for 7 years, a thick, woolen blanket they had shared without question, was now a different thing entirely. It was charged, alert, listening. He finished the motion, brought the spoon to his lips, and tasted the soup. It was the same as always. She was a good cook, had learned his tastes without ever having to be told. She knew he liked his broth thick, his bread with a hard crust, his coffee black and bitter as regret. He swallowed. The warmth spread through his chest, a familiar comfort that could not reach the cold knot that had formed in his gut. He could feel her eyes on him. He had felt her eyes on him for 7 years, but this was different. Before, her gaze had been watchful, a quiet assessment of his needs, his moods, the weather of his face. Now, it was a question. He risked a glance. Mara sat opposite him at the small pine table he had built the first year he was alone, the year before she came. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture straight, her head tilted just so. The firelight caught the soft strands of hair that had escaped her braid, turning them to threads of spun gold. She was no longer the half-starved, hollow-eyed child he had found huddled in his barn, a ghost in a threadbare dress with the snows of a hard winter clinging to her. She was a woman now. He had watched it happen so slowly he had almost missed it, the way a man watching a mountain doesn't see it wear down. The angles of her face had softened, the fear in her eyes had receded, replaced by a deep, settled calm that was as much a part of the cabin as the smell of wood smoke and drying lavender. She did not look away when his eyes met hers. There was no shame in her gaze, no apology, just a quiet statement. Husband. The word echoed in the new silence, stripping the years away, rearranging the furniture of his soul. He had been a husband once before, to Eleanor. The name was a phantom limb, an ache he had learned to live with. Eleanor, with her laughter like wind chimes, and her hands that were never still. This cabin was their dream, built with his own 2 hands on a piece of land that was supposed to be there forever. But forever had been a scant 3 years. The fever took her in the dead of winter, her last breath a frosted pane of glass he had watched shatter. He had buried her on the rise behind the cabin, beneath the lone ponderosa pine that looked out over the valley. He had become a creature of silence then, a man whittled down to the bone by grief. And then, the girl had come. Mara. She had never told him her name. He had given it to her. She had been mute, not from a flaw in her throat, but from a terror so profound it had stolen her voice. He had seen her tracks in the snow leading from the east, from nowhere he could account for. There were other tracks, too, heavier, a man's boot prints, that had followed hers for a time before turning back toward the town of Iron Hollow, as if the pursuer had given up the chase at the edge of Dorr's land. Samuel had brought her inside, wrapped her in one of Eleanor's old quilts, and set a bowl of stew in front of her. She had eaten like a wolf, her eyes never leaving his face, her body tensed to flee. He had not asked her questions. He did not have the words for them, and he knew she did not have the answers. He had simply pointed to the small cot in the corner, and she had slept for 2 days. When she woke, she began to work. She swept the floor, She fed the chickens. She washed the dishes, her small hands careful with the chipped porcelain plates that had been Eleanor's. She moved through the cabin with a ghostly quiet, a shadow that tidied and cleaned and asked for nothing in return. He had expected her to leave when the thaw came, to move on to wherever she had been going. But she stayed. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, and she was still there. She had a worn apron now, one of Eleanor's, tied loosely around her waist. She learned the rhythms of his grief, the days he would spend staring at the pine on the hill, the nights he would sit by the fire and not move until the embers were gray ash. She never intruded. She would simply leave a plate of food on the table for him, a cup of coffee, a silent offering. They had forged a language without words. A tilt of his head meant he needed the axe. A glance at the woodpile meant it was getting low. She would nod, a small, economical movement, and the task would be done. He learned her signs as well. The way she would twist a loose thread on her sleeve meant she was troubled. The way she would hum, a sound so low it was more a vibration in the air than a melody, meant she was content. They had orbited each other in this silent dance for 2,555 nights. He had provided shelter and food. She had provided a presence, a quiet companionship that had slowly, imperceptibly, filled the hollow spaces in his life. He had thought of her as a daughter, a ward, a stray he had taken in. He had never, not once, thought of her as a wife. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard labor. They were an old man's hands. He was 47. Not ancient, but the years had been hard. He felt a chasm of age and experience between them. What did she see when she looked at him? A savior? A jailer? A father? Or something else entirely? Husband. The word was an absurdity. A brand she had placed on him without his consent. And yet, was it? Had he not provided for her, protected her, shared his home and his hearth with her? Had they not lived as man and woman, in all ways but one? The bed they shared was the cabin itself. The intimacy was in the shared bread, the folded blanket he would leave on her cot each night, the way she would leave his mended shirt on the back of his chair. He cleared his throat. The sound was harsh, rusty from disuse. He had not spoken a full sentence to her in years. "The soup is good," he said. His voice was a stranger's in his own ears. Mara blinked, as if surprised by the sound. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She picked up her spoon and began to eat, her movements graceful and deliberate. The silence returned, but it was a different country now. They had crossed a border. He could feel the map of his life being redrawn. That night, when the fire was low and the cabin was filled with the soft sounds of a house settling, he watched her from his chair. She cleared the table, washed the dishes in the basin, her back to him. The worn apron, a faded calico print that had once been Eleanor's, was tied neatly around her waist. He remembered the day Eleanor had bought the fabric in Iron Hollow, her excitement, a bright, shining thing. He had loved that about her, the way she could find joy in small, simple things. Mara was different. Her joy was a quieter thing, a secret she kept hidden deep inside. He saw it sometimes in the way she would pause to watch a hummingbird at the window, or the gentle way she would handle a new chick. She finished her chores, untied the apron, and folded it carefully, placing it on the shelf by the stove. It was a ritual he had watched 1,000 times. Then she went to her cot in the corner. He had built it for her that first winter, a simple frame of pine with a straw-stuffed mattress. She pulled back the blanket he had left there for her, the heavy wool one he had folded and placed at the foot of her bed every evening since the first frost. She slipped under the covers, her movements fluid and silent. She lay on her side, facing the wall, her dark braid a stark line against the white pillowcase. He did not go to his own bed. He sat in his chair by the dying fire, the tin cup of cold coffee in his hand. He had passed that cup to her at the well that first day, a silent offering of water. She had drunk from it, her eyes never leaving his, and passed it back. They had shared it ever since, a small, unconscious sacrament. He stared into the glowing embers, his mind a maelstrom. Husband. Had she said it because she felt trapped? Because she thought it was what he wanted to hear? Or was it a claim? A declaration of a truth that had grown between them in the silence, a truth he had been too blind or too stubborn to see. He thought of the journal. He had bought it in town a few years back, a leather-bound book with clean, empty pages. He had thought, foolishly, that if she could not speak, perhaps she could write. He had left it on the table for her, with a pencil. That night he had written the only entry. Found a girl. Snow's coming. He had looked at the words, stark and inadequate, and had never written in it again. The book now sat on the mantelpiece, a monument to a failed attempt at communication, but he had seen her take it down sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. She would open it to that first page and trace the letters of his rough script with her fingertip, her expression unreadable. He rose from his chair, his joints protesting. He walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up the journal. He opened it. The page was worn, the paper softened by the touch of her finger. He ran his own thumb over the words. Found a girl who was now a woman who had called him husband. He closed the book and placed it back on the mantel. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief for Eleanor, a wave of guilt so strong it almost buckled his knees. He was betraying her memory. He was letting this silent girl take her place, in her apron, in her home. But the guilt was followed by another feeling, something more complex and unsettling. It was a feeling of gratitude. Mara had not replaced Eleanor. She had simply filled the silence Eleanor's passing had left behind. She had tended to the embers of his life, keeping them from going out completely. She had asked for nothing, and he had given her nothing but the barest necessities of survival. And yet, she had stayed. She had chosen to stay. He walked over to his chair by the fire. It was old, the wood worn, smooth by years of use. He ran his hand over the back of it, his fingers tracing the familiar grain, and then he felt it, a series of small, faint scratches in the wood. He leaned closer, angling the chair to catch the last of the firelight. He could just make them out, carved into the wood with what must have been a pin or a small nail, the letters shallow and uneven, almost invisible, Husband. He stared at the word, his heart pounding in his chest. It hadn't been a sudden impulse at the dinner table. It was a thought she had been carving into his life, little by little, for God knows how long. A secret she had been telling him every time he sat down. He sank back into the chair, the weight of those 7 years, of those 2055 nights, settling on him. He had thought he was the one providing shelter, but maybe, just maybe, they had been sheltering each other all along. He looked over at the still form on the cot, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. The cabin was quiet, but it was a different quiet now. It was the quiet of a question that had been asked, and an answer that was slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to form in the heart of a man who had thought he had nothing left to give. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair she had marked as hers, and he waited for the dawn, feeling the weight of a word he had not yet earned, but now, somehow, had to become. The next morning, the routine was the same, yet entirely different. He rose before dawn, as always, and started the fire. The kindling caught, the flames licked at the larger logs, and warmth began to seep into the cold air. He put the coffee on to boil. Usually, Mara would rise as the coffee began to perk, a silent, efficient presence at his side. But this morning, she remained on her cot, her back to the room. He could not tell if she was asleep or awake. He felt a strange reluctance to wake her, to break the spell of the night before. He poured himself a cup of coffee and went out onto the porch. The air was sharp and clean, the sky a pale, bruised purple in the east. The mountains were dark silhouettes against the coming light. He leaned against the porch railing, the tin cup warming his hands. This porch had never seen visitors. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of this land, to the walls of this cabin. He had preferred it that way. The world outside was full of noise and complications. Here, there was only the wind, the seasons, and the silence. But now, the silence had a voice. He heard the cabin door creak open behind him. He did not turn. He felt her presence beside him, a warmth in the cold morning air. She stood next to him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the heat from her body. She held her own cup, the steam rising in a delicate plume. They stood like that for a long time, watching the sun crest the mountains, painting the valley in shades of rose and gold. The world was waking up, and it felt to Samuel as if he were waking up with it, from a long 7-year slumber. "The frost was heavy last night," he said, his voice still rough. "Might lose some of the late squash." She did not answer with words. She simply reached out and touched the sleeve of his coat, a light, fleeting touch, her fingers barely grazing the rough wool. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily in 7 years. The touch was a jolt, a spark of electricity that shot up his arm and settled in his chest. It was not a passionate touch, not a lover's touch. It was a touch of acknowledgement, of connection. "I am here. I heard you." They went about their day. He mended a fence on the north pasture, the rhythmic thud of the post driver a steady beat against the quiet of the landscape. He found himself thinking of her, of the words she had carved into his chair. He tried to imagine her doing it, in the quiet of the evening, by the light of the fire, her small, determined hands working in secret. What had she been thinking? What had she been feeling? He had given her so little, a roof over her head, a place at his table. He had never offered her kindness, not really. He had offered her a lack of cruelty. He had treated her as he treated his livestock, with a detached sense of responsibility. And yet, she had seen something more in him, something he did not see in himself. When he returned to the cabin at dusk, tired and sore, the smell of roasting chicken and baked bread met him at the door. The table was set. A single wildflower, a late-blooming purple aster, sat in a small glass jar in the center of the table. He had seen her press flowers in an old book of Eleanor's, but she had never put one on the table before. It was a small thing, a splash of color in their monochrome world, but it felt like a shout. They ate in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, a shared space rather than a shared emptiness. He found himself watching her more openly, noticing the small details he had overlooked for years. The way her brow furrowed in concentration when she cut her meat. The small scar above her left eyebrow, a faint white line he had never noticed before. He wondered how she had gotten it. He wondered about the life she had lived before she had appeared in his barn, a life that was a complete mystery to him. He had never asked because he had not wanted to know. He had not wanted the burden of her past, but now he found himself wanting to know everything. After supper, as she was clearing the dishes, he spoke again. "There's a storm coming," he said, looking out the window at the darkening sky. "You can feel it in the air." She paused, her hands in the dishwater. She turned to look at him, her eyes dark and serious. "I know," she whispered. Her voice was soft, like rustling leaves. 2 words. In 2 days, she had spoken 2 words to him. "Husband, I know." It was more than he had heard from her in 7 years. He felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion bubbling up inside him. It was not quite happiness. It was more like hope, a dangerous and fragile thing. The storm broke that night, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that rattled the windows and shook the very foundations of the cabin. The fire roared in the hearth, a defiant beast against the rage of the storm. Samuel sat in his chair, listening to the wind howl. Mayra sat on her cot, mending one of his shirts by the light of a single candle, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. The storm outside, was a mirror of the storm inside him. His carefully constructed world of grief and solitude was being torn apart, and he did not know what would be left when it was over. He watched her, her head bent over her work, the candlelight softening the lines of her face. He thought of Eleanor, of the life they had planned together. He had thought that love was a thing that happened once, a bright, blazing fire that, once extinguished, could never be relit. He had been content to live in the ashes. But Mayra, with her silence and her patience and her one whispered word, had blown on the embers, and now a small, tentative flame was beginning to flicker in the darkness. He did not know what to call it. It was not the fiery passion he had felt for Eleanor. It was a quieter thing, a slower burn. It was the comfort of her presence, the shared rhythm of their days, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. It was the way she knew he took his coffee, the way he knew she was afraid of lightning. It was the wildflower on the table, the mended shirt, the word carved into his chair. It was a love that had not been declared, but had been built, piece by piece, over 2,555 nights of silence. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, there was a strange and profound peace. He looked at Mayra, and she looked up from her sewing as if she had felt his gaze. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, he knew. He knew that he would not send her away. He knew that he would not correct her. He knew that he would accept the name she had given him, and he would try, in his own fumbling, silent way, to be worthy of it. The days that followed were a quiet unfolding. The word husband was not spoken again, but it hung in the air between them, a silent covenant. The change was subtle, a series of small shifts in the landscape of their lives. He found himself talking to her more, not in long conversations, but in small observations about the weather, the land, the work that needed to be done. He told her about the hawk that had been circling the chicken coop, about the deer he had seen by the creek at dawn. And she would listen, her eyes fixed on his face, sometimes offering a soft-spoken word or two in response. She, in turn, began to leave more of herself in the open. She no longer pressed the wildflowers she collected into the pages of a book, but arranged them in jars and glasses around the cabin, small bursts of color that caught the light. One afternoon he came in from the barn to find her humming a real tune, a simple, haunting melody that seemed to speak of a deep and abiding sadness, yet also of a quiet strength. She stopped abruptly when she saw him, a blush rising on her cheeks, but he just smiled, a small, rusty smile he hadn't used in years, and she did not look away. The wall of silence had not been demolished, but they had found a gate in it, and they were slowly, cautiously, beginning to pass through. He learned that her favorite color was the deep blue of the twilight sky, that she preferred the taste of honey to sugar, that she could sit for hours watching the clouds drift by, her face a mask of serene concentration. He learned these things, not because she told him, but because he was finally paying attention. He, in turn, found himself sharing parts of himself he had thought long buried. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he picked up the old battered guitar that had been leaning in the corner, untouched since Eleanor's death. He had not been able to bring himself to play it, the memories it held too sharp, too painful. But that night, he tuned the dusty strings and began to play, his fingers stiff and clumsy at first, then slowly remembering the old chords. He played the songs Eleanor had loved, sad, lonesome ballads of lost love and hard times. He did not sing. He just played, the music filling the cabin, a voice for the grief he had never been able to put into words. Mayra sat on her cot, her mending forgotten in her lap, and she listened. She did not speak, she did not move, but he could feel her listening with her whole being. When he finished, the last note fading into the crackle of the fire, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the music, full of the shared sorrow. He looked at her, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes, silver tracks in the firelight, and he knew that she understood. The intimacy between them grew, a slow, creeping vine. It was in the way he would now hand her the tin cup at the well instead of just leaving it on the edge for her to pick up. It was in the way she would now place his plate on the table with a soft touch of her hand on his, a fleeting gesture that spoke volumes. It was in the way their eyes would meet across the room, a silent conversation passing between them. One afternoon, a cold, gray day with the threat of snow in the air, he found her on the rise behind the cabin, standing before Eleanor's grave. He had never seen her go there before. He had always considered it his private sanctuary of grief, a place she would not intrude upon. He stood at a distance, watching her. She was not crying. She simply stood there, her hands clasped before her, her head bowed. After a long moment, she knelt and cleared away the dead leaves and fallen pine needles from the simple wooden cross that marked the grave. Then she took something from her pocket. It was a small, intricately woven braid of wildflowers, long since dried, but still holding their shape and a hint of their color. She laid it gently at the base of the cross. He felt a complex mix of emotions watching her. There was a pang of jealousy, a feeling that she was trespassing on his grief. But there was also a profound sense of gratitude. She was not trying to replace Eleanor. She was honoring her. She was acknowledging the woman who had come before her, the woman whose home she now shared, whose apron she wore, whose husband she had claimed. In that moment, he understood that Mara was not a rival to Eleanor's memory. She was a keeper of it. He walked up the rise to join her. She looked up at him as he approached, her eyes clear and unafraid. He stood beside her, looking down at the grave, at the two offerings that now lay there, the weathered wooden cross he had carved, and the delicate braid of flowers she had placed there. Her name was Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She loved wildflowers. I know, Mara whispered. You have her eyes when you look at them. He had not known that. He had not known that his grief was so transparent, so easily read on his face. He looked at Mara, at this quiet, watchful woman who had seen so much more than he had ever shown her. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to tell her everything, to pour out the years of pain and loneliness, to share the burden of his past with her. But he could not. The words would not come. The silence had been his shield for too long. But perhaps, he thought, words were not necessary. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his, a small, trusting bird in his palm. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, before the grave of his first wife, the wind whispering through the pines around them. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, he did not feel alone in his grief. The first snows of winter came, blanketing the valley in a thick, pristine layer of white. The world outside the cabin grew quiet and still, the sounds muffled by the snow. Their life contracted, drawing inward, confined to the warmth of the hearth, the small circle of light cast by the lamps. The intimacy between them deepened in the forced proximity, the long, dark evenings. He taught her to play checkers, using a board he had painted on an old piece of wood and bottle caps for pieces. She was a surprisingly shrewd player, her silent concentration often leading her to victory. He would watch her as she contemplated her next move, her brow furrowed, her lips pursed, and he would feel a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She, in turn, showed him the book she had been pressing flowers in. It was an old almanac of Eleanor's, its pages filled with charts of the moon and stars, advice on planting and harvesting. But now, between the pages, was a secret garden of pressed flowers, each one a memory of a sunnier day. She would point to a flower, a delicate bluebell, a vibrant Indian paintbrush, and then point out the window toward the place where she had found it, sharing her private map of the land with him. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, piling the snow in great drifts against the cabin walls, she did something that shifted the ground beneath his feet once more. They had finished their supper, the checkerboard lying between them on the table. He had just won a game, a rare victory, and he was feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. She looked at him, a small, shy smile on her lips. Then, she reached for the journal on the mantelpiece. She brought it to the table and opened it to the first page, to his single, stark entry. Found a girl. Snow's coming. She picked up the pencil that lay beside it. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write, her letters small and neat, a stark contrast to his rough scrawl. He watched, his heart in his throat, as she wrote beneath his words. The girl found a home. She pushed the book toward him. He stared at the words, at the simple, profound declaration. The girl found a home. It was an answer to a question he had never dared to ask. It was an acceptance, a confirmation, a gift. He looked up at her, his eyes stinging. He could not speak. He could only nod, a single, jerky movement. She smiled, a real, radiant smile that lit up her face and chased the shadows from the corners of the room. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He did not let go. They sat like that for a long time, their hands clasped over the open journal, the blizzard howling outside, the fire crackling in the hearth, the silence between them no longer a void, but a vessel, full to the brim with a love that had finally found its voice, not in a shout, but in a whisper, in a handful of written words, in the simple, steady pressure of a hand in the dark. The winter was long and hard, but for the first time in years, Samuel did not feel the oppressive weight of it. The cabin, once a fortress for his grief, had become a sanctuary for something new and fragile. The shared life he and Mayra had built, once a thing of necessity and routine, was now a thing of quiet intention, of chosen companionship. The word husband remained unspoken, a single perfect note hanging in the air, its resonance felt in every shared glance, every small act of care. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, the snow receding in patches, revealing the damp, brown earth beneath. The creek began to swell with meltwater, its voice a low roar that filled the valley. The world was waking up, and with it, a sense of unease began to stir in Samuel. The winter had been an idyll, a world of their own making, sealed off from everything else. But with the spring came the opening of the passes, the return of the world beyond their land. He tried to push the feeling down, to dismiss it as the foolish anxiety of a man who had grown too comfortable in his solitude. But he could not shake the feeling that their quiet world was fragile, a delicate bubble that could be burst by the slightest touch from the outside. His fears were realized on a bright, clear afternoon in late April. He was splitting wood in the yard, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. Mayra was inside, baking bread. He could smell the warm, yeasty scent wafting from the open door. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the valley out of habit. And then he saw it. A rider, a dark speck moving slowly along the trail from Iron Hollow. His heart went cold. Visitors were not just rare, they were non-existent. In the 7 years he had lived here alone, and the 7 years since Mayra had come, not a single soul had made the journey out to his remote cabin. He watched the rider grow larger, his hand tightening on the handle of the axe. It was a man, tall in the saddle, riding a big, powerful-looking horse. He rode with an air of purpose, of grim determination, that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. He stood his ground, the axe held loosely at his side, and waited. The rider did not slow until he reached the edge of the yard. He pulled his horse to a halt and sat there for a long moment, his eyes taking in the cabin, the neat stacks of firewood, the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. He was a big man, with a hard, weathered face and cold, pale eyes. He wore a dusty duster and a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He looked like a man who was used to taking what he wanted. "This the door place?" the man called out, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "It is," Samuel answered, his own voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. The man swung down from his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He looped the reins around the hitching post and walked toward Samuel, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes sweeping over Samuel in a dismissive glance, then moving to the open cabin door. "I'm looking for a girl," the man said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Runaway. Name of Maria. Would have been about 12, 13 when she went missing. 7 years ago. Skinny thing, dark hair, scared of her own shadow." Samuel's blood ran cold. Maria. It was close enough to Mayra. He felt a wave of nausea. He had always known her past was a dark one, a thing she had fled from. Now it had followed her here. It had a face and a name. "Ain't no girl like that here," Samuel said, his voice tight. "Just me." The man's lips twisted into a sneer. "That's so? Funny. Folks in town said you took in a stray a while back. Kept her here all this time, a man living alone with a young girl. Folks talk." "Folks in town should mind their own business," Samuel said, his grip on the axe handle tightening until his knuckles were white. The man chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "I am her business. I'm her uncle, Jedediah Kane. Her pa, my brother, he died last winter. I'm her legal guardian now. I've come to take her home." "She has a home," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. Just then, Mayra appeared in the doorway. She had heard the voices. She held a loaf of bread in her hands, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror Samuel had not seen in years. It was the look of the cornered animal he had found in his barn. Kane's eyes lit up with a cruel, triumphant gleam. "Well, well, look what we have here. Maria, you've grown, filled out." His eyes roamed over her body in a way that made Samuel's stomach clench with a white-hot rage. Mayra shrank back, her body trembling. She looked at Samuel, her eyes pleading. "I told you, she's not here," Samuel said, taking a step forward, placing himself between Kane and the cabin door. "You've made a mistake. Now get off my land." Kane laughed. "I ain't going nowhere without my niece. She's family. She belongs with me." He took a step toward the porch. "Come on now, Maria. Stop this foolishness. Pack your things. We're leaving." Mayra did not move. She stood frozen in the doorway, the loaf of bread clutched to her chest like a shield. "She's not going with you," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet. He raised the axe slightly, the polished blade glinting in the afternoon sun. Kane's eyes narrowed. He looked at the axe, then back at Samuel's face. "You're a brave man, old-timer, but you're also a fool. You think you can keep her? You think the law will side with a man who's been keeping a runaway girl for 7 years? They have a name for that, you know." The threat hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. Samuel knew he was right. The law would not be on his side. They would see an old man and a young woman, and they would draw their own conclusions. But he didn't care. He would not let this man take her. He would die first. He tensed, ready to swing the axe, ready to do whatever it took. But before he could move, something shifted. Mayra, who had been cowering in the doorway, straightened up. The trembling stopped. A look of fierce, cold resolve settled on her face, a look he had never seen before. She set the loaf of bread down on the small table by the door and walked out onto the porch, her steps steady and sure. She walked past Samuel and stood between him and Jedediah Kane. She was smaller than both of them, a slight figure caught between two grim, determined men. But there was a power radiating from her, a strength that seemed to make her taller, stronger. She looked at Kane, her eyes holding his without flinching. "My name is not Maria," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the quiet yard. It was the loudest he had ever heard her speak. "It is Mara." Kane stared at her, taken aback by her sudden defiance. "It's what I say it is," he snarled. "Now get your things." "I have my things," she said, her voice unwavering. She gestured to the cabin behind her. "This is my home." "Your home is with your kin," Kane insisted, taking another step forward. "You are not my kin," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that was more powerful than a shout. "My father was not your brother. He was a good man, a man you cheated and ruined, a man you drove to his grave." Kane's face darkened with fury. "You watch your mouth, girl." "I watched you," she shot back, her voice trembling with a righteous anger that had been buried for 7 years. "I watched you drive us from our land. I watched you hunt me when I ran. I will not go with you. I will not be your property. I will not be your victim." She turned her head slightly, her eyes finding Samuel's. And in that look, he saw everything. The years of fear, the years of silence, the years of healing. And he saw the choice she was making, here and now, in the bright, unforgiving light of day. She was choosing this life, this home, this man. She turned back to Kane, her small body a formidable barrier. "This is my husband," she said, the word a shield, a sword, a declaration of war. "And this is our home. You are not welcome here. Leave, now." Jedediah Kane stood there, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He had come expecting to find a frightened, broken girl he could easily intimidate and reclaim. He had found a woman of iron, a woman who had found her voice and was using it to claim her own life. He looked from her defiant face to Samuel's grim, determined one, to the axe that was still held at the ready. He saw two people, united and unmovable. He was a bully, and his power lay in fear. And these two people were no longer afraid. He spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "Both of you." He turned without another word, strode to his horse, and swung himself into the saddle. He gave them one last look of pure hatred, then wheeled his horse around and galloped away, a dark, retreating figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. They stood there, Samuel and Mara, side by side on the porch, and watched until he was gone. The sound of his horse's hooves faded, and the silence of the valley returned, deeper and more profound than before. The air, which had been thick with tension and menace, was now clean and light. The threat had passed. The battle had been fought and won, not with violence, but with a few brave words. Mara began to tremble, the adrenaline leaving her body, the years of suppressed terror finally finding a release. Samuel put the axe down and wrapped his arms around her. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his chest, her body shaking with silent sobs. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring her name over and over again. "Mara, it's all right. You're safe. You're home." He held her for a long time until the shaking subsided and her breathing grew steady. She did not pull away. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, as if she belonged there. And he realized, with a sense of wonder that was almost overwhelming, that she did. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The day was ending. A chapter of their lives had closed, and a new one was beginning. They stood on the porch of the small cabin, two solitary figures against the vastness of the wilderness, no longer just a man and a woman, but a husband and a wife, forged not by ceremony or law, but by 7 years of shared silence and a single, courageous moment of truth. They went inside as the last of the light faded. The cabin was quiet, the loaf of bread she had been baking sitting on the table, a simple, wholesome promise of sustenance. She lit the lamps, her movements slow and weary, but graceful. He rebuilt the fire, the familiar ritual a comfort, a return to the rhythm of their life. They sat down to eat their supper. The silence between them had returned, but it was a new silence, a final silence. It was not the silence of grief or fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of peace, of acceptance, of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. It was the silence of a home that had been defended and secured. It was the silence of a future that was, at last, their own. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down her past to claim her present, at the quiet girl who had become his fierce protector, his partner, his wife. He felt a love for her so deep and so profound, it left him breathless. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, but he knew that words were no longer necessary. They had said all that needed to be said. He didn't answer with words, just moved his chair closer,